visto ver tantas caras. It is a great pleasure today to welcome you all, and in particular to welcome Dr. Mark Stafford Smith. He is one of the probably only left polymath in this universe. He has such a broad background that you cannot summarize it in a short curriculum vitae. Thereby, he's going to present himself. He wants to present himself, but I would like to first give some personal note on my encounter with Mark Stafford Smith. My encounter with Mark Stafford Smith has been personally indirectly because I learned about the dryland development paradigm, and the students that have taken my class know what I'm talking about because you all had to take exams on the dryland development paradigm. And now you see Mark Stafford Smith together with Jim Reynolds, they put this together. And so Mark has been spearheading the advancement of research in drylands very substantially. And right now, today, he's going to tell us about his long history, evolution, as a dryland specialist, not only as a researcher, but also in advocating policy, very, not only in theory, but actually in practice. And without further ado, I would like to give Mark now the microphone, and please enjoy this talk. I invite you to collect your questions for after the talk, and in the afternoon we have a session at 5 o'clock in the second floor in the Edificio Alpha, if you're interested in continuing the discussion session. Mark.
It's not such a good start. Well, buenas tardes. I'm afraid that's about the extent of my Spanish, which is not very good. So whatever other attributes I may have, I'm not very good on that front. It's wonderful to see so many people here today. It's very exciting to me, actually, to come here to Mexico too and see some of the landscapes around here, and to understand some of the issues that you're facing, which I know today are quite significant with the earthquake and the cyclone, but hopefully those won't affect us here today at this actual time. I struggled a little bit thinking about what to talk about here because I know you're a very diverse audience, and so I'm going to try and cover quite a few things without great depth. So I hope you can collect questions and ask me more about areas that interest you, but that I don't spend too long on things that don't interest people. I thought I would just start with a couple of slides about the organisation that I belong to, CSIRO, so you know the sort of background that I have there. But then also a couple of slides about myself. I was saying to Elizabeth that I wanted to tell you a little bit about where I came from anyway, and that will lead into the challenges, the issues that I think we face. So if I start here, probably just need to point in the right direction, and I need to make sure this is on. Oh, it's changed. So I work for an organisation called CSIRO, which is the Australians' National Strategic Applied Research Organisation, perhaps a little bit similar to all the collected institutions under CONICET, although all of our organisation is aimed at strategic applied research. You can see some statistics there. We have about 5,000 staff in total, and our mandate is very much to deliver value to Australia. So all of our projects really have to engage with either industry or government policy or community, and have some pathway to having an impact. And that's an important thing which informs my approach to research, I guess. You can see that we're quite significant in terms of things that we do for Australian and for the Australian economy, and indeed we have a whole range of different areas that we cover, probably somewhat similar in diversity to to the areas that you, or at least the institutions of CONCERT does, from things like agriculture and food, through the energy side of things, health. My own institute is the Land and Water, deals with land resources and how we look after them. Areas of manufacturing for industry, mining and mineral resources, and then our marine resources, and we do also a lot of climate modelling. We also run a number of facilities for our nation, including Data 61, which is a major computing effort. So that just gives you an idea of the range of topics that we deal with. I wanted to have one slide just saying where I myself had come from, so forgive me this indulgence, but I was actually born in the UK, in England. I spent some time early in my career working in North Africa and the Sahara, but then I went to Australia and I've been there ever since, and I'm definitely Australian now, even when we're playing cricket. And I lived for a while in Canberra, working in the rangelands there, not far from there, and then in Alice Springs for 20 years, which is right in the middle of the continent, as you can see. But 10 years ago, I moved back to Canberra, and through that time, the sort of research I was involved in went from some early stuff in Africa on mosquitoes, but through work on animals and how they were managed for pastoralism, to thinking about decision support systems for whole properties, to thinking about the whole of inland Australia and how pastoral activities interacted with conservation and mining and other activities there, and in fact how the economy worked generally. We ran an organisation called the Desert Knowledge Cooperative Research Centre that dealt with that for a while. And then since I've been back in Canberra, thinking much more about adapting to climate change, and I want to talk a little bit about several bits of this today. In conjunction with all of that, I was involved in various international things, here we go, which involved a variety of organisations at the global level that were coordinating international research, and that in turn will inform some of the things I want to talk about in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. And some of you may have been involved in some of these. I think they've been a very important part of getting coordination around research globally. Now, I wanted to go further still and introduce you to two more members of my family, because this is, I think, for me, a very interesting way of thinking about how the world has changed in the last 90 years. So this year, as it happens, is quite significant for my family because my mother is 90, I'm 60, and my eldest son is 30. Now, when you think about that, my mother, who's on the left here, who is still travelling on, she, during her lifetime, has seen the world population increase over threefold. In fact, I think even more importantly than that, our global use of energy and our global GDP has increased over tenfold. So this issue of increasing consumption has been a very significant one for putting pressure on the planet. I've realised this year, though, my son was 30, and I was showing this picture here, which is actually the average temperature across the whole of the Australian landmass, averaged each year for the last 100 years, and then compared to the period in the 1960s to the 1990s as a sort of zero. And it's not hard to see what the trend is here, which I'm sure you all are well aware of, the increasing global temperatures. But it means that my son, who was born here, 30 years old, has essentially never seen a year that was below average. And I find that a pretty amazing statistic, and one which really brings home the implications of climate change for the next generation. So really, putting those things together, this increasing population, the increasing affluence, and the resulting changes in climate, this was an image from northern Italy, which really struck me as sort of summarising all of that. But what it really links to, I think, is this idea that we have entered the Anthropocene, this age in which human beings are really a force of geological magnitude on the planet, and we're actually now moving more sediment than all the rivers in the world. We're obviously having all sorts of impacts on the planet, and ones which are very much accelerating away, as you could see in that graph with my mother. So, that's a big challenge. But I think one of the important issues around these challenges and these problems that we face is that we have to be also thinking about the positive side of them. And actually, 2015 was, in my mind, a really exceptional year for the planet, because we had three major agreements which were undertaken at the global scale. There was the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in the early part of the year in Sendai. In September, there was the agreement to the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll be saying a bit more about. And then, of course, towards the end of the year, there was the Paris Agreement on climate change, which were all very important. Of course, not all things flow out exactly as you plan, so we've had a few little changes since then, which aren't necessarily completely in track with these goals. But nonetheless, I think for scientists, for researchers, these global goal-setting efforts by policymakers actually really present us with a challenge. They really say to us, as policymakers, we've said where we want to go. Now you guys have got to help us get there. And so this is a really big challenge for us going forwards. And that's what sits behind really the rest of what I'm going to talk about. So, having a bit of trouble with this thing here. I'm aiming it wrong. Here we go. One of the approaches to trying to tackle that is this organisation, Future Earth, which I mentioned very briefly earlier, which I've had the privilege of chairing the Science Committee for in its first incarnation. And Future Earth, so I just want to mention Future Earth, and I'll mention it again very briefly at the end, but just to say that it is a global platform to try and coordinate research towards global sustainability and human well-being. And in order to do that, to answer that challenge really that the policymakers have set us, it really has to try and bring this research to be much more integrated across disciplines, because these problems are not easily dealt with in silos. It demands that we become more solutions-oriented, that we really think about what policymakers and society, businesses need, so to try and generate knowledge that answers to that. To do that, research, I think, has to become much closer to society. We have to have much stronger partnerships. And all of that really is doing this. It's responding to this need for a more nimble global innovation system that can actually cope with this increasing rates of change that we're seeing happening in the world. And if you want to, I'll put the website of this up at the end. So that sits also in the background to what we're doing. So in the rest of the talk, I want to try and address three things mainly, and I'll spend a little bit of time on each one, and I feel like I haven't gone into enough depth, but hopefully you'll ask me questions if you would like to. Firstly, I want to talk a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals as an overarching framework for thinking about where we're trying to go, and I'll tackle that for a little bit. Then I want to switch tack a little bit and talk about some of the work that we've been doing on adapting to climate change and other long-term changes in Australia, and see whether there's some things of interest to you there. And then thirdly, I will come to the issue that's very dear to my heart, and I know Elizabeth's, which is what the future of the drylands is and how all of this relates to that. So let me see how I can go through all of that. So firstly, I'm sure many of you are well aware of the Sustainable Development Goals, but just one slide of history here. As you may also be aware, we had the Millennium Development Goals, which were actually formally agreed in 2002, but which ran from 2000 to 2015 as a set of goals, which were aimed very much at developing countries. They were specifically targeted at that. And there were 8 of them. They weren't terribly integrated, but they did do some very important things. And I think they provided us with some strong messages going forwards, which was that by having some clear targets, it really did mobilise global investment. And several of the targets of the Millennium Development Goals we did actually manage to meet in terms of halving poverty and a number of other topics like that. At the same time, all the reports indicated that there were a number of areas in there which weren't met, where we really needed accelerated activity and progress. And it was also very clear that the 7th goal here, which was about environmental sustainability, was very poorly integrated. In fact, it didn't really deal with many of the aspects of environmental sustainability anyway, and it was very poorly integrated into the others. And so, I mean, the real concern about that is that we might meet, even if we might meet the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, in developing countries, that those successes are then undermined by continuing global change at a global level. And of course, and that would be happening because we are not actually coordinating the short-term outcomes that might be developmental with the long-term implications in terms of sustainability, which of course actually involve all nations, not just developing nations anyway. And that sat behind the development of the Rio Plus 20 meeting in 2012 and the SDGs that came out of that. We were involved a bit in the run-up to Rio Plus 20 in the discussion about these goals, and really a lot of the discussion emerged from this fact that there are 700 or so, more than 700 multilateral environmental agreements. We're not lacking in agreements about what we ought to do at a global level. And the key concern around them, in many ways, not only the environmental agreements, but also trade agreements and other things like that, is that we really need to coordinate amongst them, because so many of them can act in opposition to each other if there isn't some way of connecting them together. And so a lot of the concern at that stage of developing these was around the potential benefits to be had from synergies between different agreement areas, and also the potential trade-offs between them that needed to be managed in order that we didn't have the effect that I was talking about with the Millennium Development Goals. But in addition, these goals had to add up in some way to global sustainability, because there's no point being sustainable in one area if the rest of the world is unsustainable and you still get hit by climate change, as we know. And the same applies to human well-being. And so that implied that these had to be universal. Some of you may well be aware that behind all of this there was ideas like the idea of planetary boundaries, the fact that there may be some biophysical limits to what the planet can cope with and stay within Holocene conditions, which are the ones that we've evolved in. And then those physical things got linked up in this idea of a donut, the physical limits on the outside, but the social and human well-being foundations on the inside, to help define this idea of a safe and just space for humanity that sits in the ring of the donut. Anyway, all of those did eventually flow through in some way into the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are, as you may know, there are 17 of them. There's 169 targets that sit under that, and there's now 240 indicators of progress against them. But for me, actually, the targets in detail are not so important. Of course, it matters that we try to meet them, but the detail of them, they were politically negotiated, and they're not always exactly what you would ideally have. And the indicators, in turn, are not necessarily the best ones either. What I think is the most valuable thing about the SDGs is the idea that, in fact, you have this overall framework of things that actually really does set a vision for where we want the planet and human beings to go to. And I think that is incredibly powerful. And it enables us to tackle this issue of interactions and how things interact amongst themselves. Because you can take any one of these goals, like the health goal here, and ask, well, how is it affected by the achievement of all the others? And in fact, how does its achievement affect the successes of the other ones as well? And then you can start exploring some of the potentially amazing synergies and challenging trade-offs that might come out of this. So here's just an example, which is, it just highlights how many connections there are across these things. The example is that if you have access to local energy, so for example, renewable energy in all households for cooking, so that's one of the goals that's part of the targets of SDG 7. That can reduce local pollution and emissions, so that helps both the health side and also the climate goal, so that's goals 3 and 13. It can free up women and children to have more time for education and for engaging in the workforce or for doing other things like that. That's 2 more of the goals, SDG 8 and 10. It can have improve impacts on biodiversity by reducing wood cutting around villages, SDG 13. So there's this whole flow on, and in fact, there are modelling examples coming out now showing that if you do integrate these things and you targeted, for example, if you targeted energy to households that are currently burning solid fuels, you could simultaneously reduce global warming over the next few decades by a significant amount, a bit under 0.1 degrees C, and avoid 10 million premature deaths. So we're slowly starting to gather more evidence, more data to actually demonstrate that if you really try and work with these synergies, you can achieve far better outcomes than you would if you don't do that. And of course the same applies to thinking about trade-offs. So carrying that behind in our minds, there was a report that came out recently, if anyone's interested in looking at this, from the International Council for Science, which is one of the sponsors of Future Earth, which actually did a formal systematic analysis of all of the interactions that they could think of that related to 4 of the SDGs. So you can imagine this would be a big task to do all of them, but slowly over the next few years we need to do that. And I think a very important policy message out of this was that when they looked at the 300 or so interactions that they could find there, that actually most of them, about 3/4 of those interactions, were positive. So there are real opportunities for synergistic gains to be had by doing that. I think there are also some really important opportunities for research in this, in actually pursuing those positive opportunities, whether you're doing it for technologies that might help deliver on some of those synergies, or whether you're just looking for the sort of benefits that there might be for ecosystem services. And so that's something I might return to a little bit later on in the context of thinking how some of these messages can flow through to business interactions. Here we go. So that first little section there, this is about facing all of this rapid change that the planet is facing. And I think the importance of the SDGs is they provide this incredibly valuable overall framing for all sorts of work, and it's worth carrying that in mind for both the challenges and the opportunities. And I think particularly important in that are these synergies and trade-offs that also demand us to create linkages across our research disciplines to try and deal with those. So now let me change tack for a minute and talk a bit more about adaptation. And here I'm really thinking about responses to long-term changes in general, although climate change is one particular and important example of that. And I think in the last 20 years, particularly in the climate change side, there has been a sort of messaging, a narrative around climate change that it's this incredibly overwhelming problem that every time we hear about it, it's a worse problem, and maybe the Antarctic's going to melt more quickly. That it's pretty uncertain exactly where it's going to end up, because of course exactly where it ends up depends a lot on our decisions, our political decisions about how much to reduce emissions. But it's off in the future, and we're always talking about 2070 or 2100. And as a consequence, all of those things make it very disempowering for policymakers and for individuals in society as well. You have all of these sorts of words that just make it very hard to think. So I think we've been working very hard to try and change this narrative. And here's just some aspects that I want to talk about that we're trying to pursue. Firstly, it's really important that we spend more time talking about solutions, the actual responses to climate change and to other long-term changes like this, instead of always explaining more about the problem. That just disempowers people. When you start asking about solutions, it immediately pushes you to think about decisions today, so it brings it into the now for people. You've still got to think occasionally about what the implications of those decisions are in 2070, but instead of always talking about what the level of change is in 2100, you're actually talking about decisions today. When you are talking about decisions, then you can start getting much more specific about the risk management that's needed around each decision, and actually, and instead of being lost in uncertainty, which is something that I think people get very confounded by. And of course, we have many, many ways of successfully managing risks in society. We actually have lots of approaches to that, so we can bring those to bear. I think a really important fourth point is that it takes us away from thinking just about the technical constraints and more technical knowledge about climate change into thinking about the challenges in terms of human values and our institutions, which are often the barriers which challenge us for getting action. And along with that goes this last point here, which is that climate change is almost always in the Department of Environment, and so it gets cast as an environmental issue. But we know that you can see around Texas and probably Florida tomorrow that this is not an environmental issue primarily. It's a social and economic issue, which obviously has environmental elements as well. And so trying to shift that narrative to have people recognise that this is something that's a mainstream concern that the Department of Treasury should be worrying about, not just the Department of Environment, is very important. And so in thinking about these issues and other related ones, I guess we've been gradually evolving our thinking on adaptation in Australia to what we would now call third generation adaptation thinking that tries to take account of some of these things. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me try and show you. So I think first generation climate change adaptation thinking, and in fact first generation thinking about most of these long-term environmental changes, tends to take a risk management sort of approach like this. The classic thing where you have exposure and sensitivity, you have potential impact, you have a degree of adaptive capacity, and you have a consequent vulnerability. And the problem is that that's where people get stuck. So we just go on getting more and more of the problem and more about how vulnerable people are, rather than thinking about the solutions. So, I mean, the second generation approach to this has been around for a long time, really. It's just that we still get stuck on doing this a lot of the time and just getting more precision on impacts and vulnerability. But the second generation is to put this into some sort of adaptive management cycle, and these are very common. I'm sure everyone here has been involved. This is an example from the UK, and the point about it is that it's not that you don't need to know about the problem, you still need to know about it, but it's just one small step in this overall cycle of understanding the problem, thinking about some solutions, prioritising the ones you do now, implementing them, monitoring them, learning from that, and then doing the cycle again. And that's a very different and much more empowering sort of approach to thinking about these problems, because you're actively moving into the solution space. And as you do that, then some of these sorts of little tools become useful. One of the ones we use is the idea of decision lifetimes. So if you're planting a crop, an annual crop this year, you don't need to worry about 2070 because you're going to plant another, whatever it is, 53 crops between now and then. But if you're thinking about plant breeding, for example, it takes 15 years or so to breed a new cultivar and get it into commercial use. So then you've got to be thinking out to at least the 2030s. If you're putting in dams or big transport infrastructure, that's probably going to be there for at least 40 or 50, perhaps longer, 40 or 50 years. So there you do need to start thinking about 2060, 2070 perhaps. If you're thinking about forest succession, that's more like getting up to 100 years sort of time frame. And if you're thinking about where to put a new subdivision, then once they're in place, it's very hard to move them. You're thinking more than centuries really, and so you don't really want to be building them below sea, where they may be below sea level in a century or two's time. So by thinking about this, the first thing it does is it reduces the cognitive load of feeling like everything's affected by climate change. All of those things will be affected by climate change, but today's decisions don't need to take in account climate change for all of them, except where we're already experiencing it, of course. And that means that at least some of you don't need to leap into doing things ahead of time like this, which doesn't look very secure in a site plan, I must say. What it also does is to enable you to think about the particular elements of climate change that you're facing and ask what is the risk management that's appropriate to that particular element. And I could spend more time on that, but the main point is that there are plenty of good, well-established methods for managing risks that you can then put into place. It also leads you into thinking about how decisions play out over time. And so we have this idea of adaptation pathways, which I think is becoming more and more common around the world, which actually enables you to think in a much more flexible way about some of these longer term decisions and not get caught up in the difficulty of making a decision now about something where we can't be totally sure about what will happen in 2070. This is a classic example of this. This is the Thames Estuary defences for London from flooding. And you won't be able to read the detail here, but the important idea is that there are a number of different options here which can cope with different levels of sea level rise across the top here, basically. And what the people here have done is to lay out this variety of options, which ones would be able to deal with different amounts of sea level rise, right up to the idea of having a new barrage to replace the barrage that they have there now. Now that would be a really expensive option, so you don't want to do it now and find that you don't need it for 20 or 30 or 50 years. So they've done this, and then they've basically plotted a route through there. That's this green line here, which at the moment, at this point in time, seems like the most sensible sequence of decisions. And so it goes, do a few extra defences, expand some flood storage, and then eventually, when you reach this threshold of 2 metres or so of sea level rise, put a new barrage in. And the important thing is that there are decision points in this, and so that when you do reach 1 metre of sea level rise, you can stop and ask again, is this the most sensible route, or should we be going straight to a barrage, or what, as we start to learn more about the future. So the idea of adaptation pathways is really important. They can be used in many different ways. So this is one which we've done in Australia, which is a region in a regional planning context, where we have worked with a number of different sectors to think about the things that they think they might need to do over the next 20 to 30 years. And then this map here puts the major activities all together, and you can see in the whole region how things might play out over time, what things might need investment at the same time, and do things like that which can help governments plan a future ahead. So I think this is a really valuable sort of approach to thinking about things. I mean, just as a couple of slides that are a bit more abstract and theoretical, this is how you can think about this adaptation pathway idea, where you've got a series of decisions over time. You've got a sort of area here where things are adaptive, where you're coping with whatever the climate is throwing at you. And then you have this maladaptive space which you don't want to get into, where you would actually not be ready for the sort of climate impacts or other long-term changes that you might be facing. And the idea is you've got a series of decisions. You can revisit the decision. At this point, it seems like this is the best route, but it may be that when you get to here, it turns out to be better to go that way. And you've got the option, and you can confidently do a first step, knowing that you're still keeping options open later on. So that's the general, more theoretical idea of adaptation pathways. And you can use them in other contexts. So we've used them with remote communities, Aboriginal communities in Central Australia, thinking much more about social issues as well. This is an example, thinking about heat waves and how people respond to that. And I won't go into it in detail, but just to say, you can use them in very non-technical ones. So I think our second generation adaptation planning is starting to use all of these sorts of things, using this adaptive cycle. But if you just do this, it doesn't really specifically help you to carry out these sorts of adaptation pathways plannings, and it doesn't deal with a number of other things very explicitly. It's not incompatible with these other things, but it doesn't specifically deal with some of the social issues and other such things. And so there's a couple of ideas here which I'll just bring in, which take us a bit more towards this third generation. The first of them is the idea of really making sure that we understand the economic and social implications of things. This is a pretty straightforward idea because we do it in all other parts of society, but we haven't done this very well in adapting to climate change, or in fact in dealing with many of these other long-term changes. This is an example of a study in Australia. It's just to illustrate that you can really bring a lot of big data together and big models and do something that's useful for policymakers. So here we were looking at the total damage from four hazards, in this case coastal inundation from sea level rise, extreme winds, inland flooding and fire, out to over the next century. on residential housing right across Australia. So Australia there, about 2,000 kilometres across, modelled down almost to the individual house level, the individual building. And we find that just in terms of impacts, if we didn't do anything, there'll be a large number, $200 billion worth of impact, and that's a discounted impact for economists amongst you. So it's really it's allowing for discount rates. The important thing is, though, that's just the problem. This study went on to look at potential solutions. So it was looking at the benefits of proactive adaptation, using adaptation measures that we understand and know very well, so that it's not as if it's new things that we have to imagine, that we have to develop. And just with simple things that we know well, we can halve that impact, and we can do that. That's again discounted. And the discounted return on investment is about 10 to 1, so it's a hugely beneficial thing to do. And in fact, we're almost certainly underestimating the benefits, because most of the impacts happen in a small part of the continent, and we can target that much better. So I guess what this is trying to do is to say, not only do we have the ability to model the potential impacts in the future, but we can also model the benefits of acting on them. And in particular, from a policy point of view, we're showing here that being proactive about that, so making the buildings more resilient to all of these impacts, and also where the institutions are set up in a way which allows some sort of decision to happen. And so really, you only get decisions where these three things are met, or if you get them outside there, you'll probably have conflict later about it. This is really important, because it's an easy way of just asking yourself, when you're looking at a particular challenge, are we only looking through one lens, or are we making sure that all three of these things are considered? A concrete example for us in Australia is the issue of sea level rise on the coast and coastal retreat, getting houses to move back from the coast. So we're starting to see this sort of erosion this is our Gold Coast in Brisbane, in Queensland in Australia. And we're starting to see this sort of coastal erosion, and local councils are starting to have to try and put constraints on people building right against the seashore. But there are huge conflicts in values about this, because the people who have houses there don't want to let go of them, they don't want to see their property prices go down. The people who have houses, and so they want defences on the coast. The people who live a bit further back still want a nice beach, not a big concrete blockage there. And in fact, we have a complex system of local and state governments, and we don't really have the right institutions to resolve those conflicts. And so in this particular case, we know pretty well what's going to happen on the sea level rise front and how this is going to play out in a broad sense. But the bigger challenges, which actually need research as well, are in these institutional and values areas. So an important aspect of this is that over time, these values and rules and knowledge aspects actually interact with each other, and they co-evolve, they evolve as well. And so understanding that's really important, and it leads us into the whole area of thinking about complex adaptive systems there. If you take it back to my little map of an adaptation pathway, before I had this little bit here where the adaptive space was reasonably straightforward and we knew where it was going out there. But in fact, of course, the reality is much more complex than that, and this is where we're sort of headed with this third generation. We have the maladaptive space, because of changing institutions and values, is changing, it's not straight. We have the potential for things that need transformation. In order to avoid going into maladaptation, we may need a major change. We have other issues going on, such as the issues of path dependency. So where we've come from may affect where we can go in the future. That's very common. We have all sorts of path dependencies. And indeed, it may well be that the institutions we have today are not actually adaptive now anyway, so we may have to make a transformation before we can even get going on any of this. So, and I'll just say to those of you in the audience who are technologists, that actually these things apply very strongly to the use of technologies too, and so I think there are some very interesting questions to ask around these values and institutions. and how they may in fact evolve over time and either enable or prevent your innovations actually being put into effect. Right. Okay. And just the last slide on this really is to say I think there are also great opportunities in this for thinking about talking to stakeholders about where research can be applied. So this is an idea of developing exportable adaptive economies, which we've been talking to industry about in Australia too. And it's the idea that to find the ideal place where we could focus our innovation efforts, our research, there's a sort of combination. You have to have the local skills that you've got. You have to have the local skills, of course, to build on. If you're trying to do this in, if you like, the sustainability area, which might relate to SDGs, then you're looking for things in here. But actually, if you can do it in an area where you're also meeting your local future challenges, the adaptive challenges that you'll face over the next few decades, then you have a sort of sweet spot in here where you have not only a valuable local market, but you've also got a potential international market, and you've got a better chance of making that all work. So, and you can start to analyse where that might actually be by linking regional development plans that may understand what the capabilities that you have regionally are with the adaptation needs, so the sort of analyses of assessments of climate change, with that SDG lens to ask how that might all change. We've been doing this in South Australia, where I think you guys have taken all the car industry, and so we no longer have a car industry there. The last place just closed down. And the people, the small firms that were delivering to the car industry are now thinking about how they could instead deliver into energy systems, sustainability sort of systems. And by doing this analysis, actually some of what they've come up with, for example, is that in the region we have a lot of horticulture, but it's going to have real challenges with water. We've got these skills that can produce pumps and filters and all sorts of other things. And so they can be developing some really interesting and innovative irrigation, water recycling things that are sitting right in this sweet spot here and have potential for export, but also are very important locally. Okay, so at CSIRO we have a whole series of things then, from concepts such as some of the ones I've been talking about, linked to a variety of decision support platforms and planning tools, linked in turn to some processes which can help with the capacity building and engaging with the community, which we can then play out through a variety of different sectors, which is where we think we are moving towards this idea of third generation adaptation. And on the right there is a guideline that's just come out for our federal government for doing planning along these lines. So where I've got to there is the issues of adaptation and transformation, really trying to think about these concepts and tools. I think there are more and more of them appearing for handling long-term change. I think this really helps us bring technical knowledge together with the social and human research that's relevant to this. And I think all of this provides us with some exciting opportunities to talk to stakeholders, whether they're in business or in government or in the community, about things that might be particularly likely to help their future economies and their livelihoods. Now, I am getting worried about the amount of time I'm taking here, so I'll go quickly through this last segment, which is getting into the drylands side of things. I guess I want to now pick up a few of those messages, but think about the dryland side in particular, so I hope some of you are fascinated by dryland like me. And really, these are all facing the sorts of issues that I've just been talking about. In the SDGs, the drylands do appear. There's one SDG that deals with land generally, which includes the desertification issues, and has a target which is particularly focused on drylands and on this new idea that has been emerging in the UN Convention for Combating Desertification about land degradation neutrality. I don't know whether you've heard about this, but this is the idea that we should be striving for a world where the net amount of healthy and productive land resources stays at least steady or preferably increases. But in order to allow some development to happen, that may be achieved by having offsets where you may develop one area and lose ecosystem services there, but you will always, in that case, more than compensate for it by improving them somewhere else. And this is being operationalized in terms of some fairly technical indicators around land cover and land productivity and carbon stocks. But I think it doesn't take very much thought to think that however good the technical aspects are, actually this is going to interact with all the other goals. And Elizabeth's already mentioned the dryland development paradigm that we developed about a decade ago. And it has 5 ideas really about these remote, uncertain environments that drylands are, which I won't go through in detail, but it's really just to say that they start to lay out some of the issues that one should think about for at any time that you're dealing with drylands. But I will just say they particularly emphasise the need to think of them as a coupled human environment or social ecological system. That's true everywhere, but it's particularly important in drylands. It does ask you to think about the longer-term slow changes that are happening, things like population and other issues like that may take these environments into across thresholds. And it does emphasise the idea that these are networked across scales in ways that matter particularly for drylands because they're remote from policy centres. So this was intended very much as a sort of diagnostic to think about dryland systems, and it arose really because in the early 2000s there was a great deal of, there were 3 major conflicting paradigms in mental models in people's heads about why desertification was happening. One, that it was driven by climate, another that it was driven by local mismanagement, which meant you just had to tell all the local pastoralists what to do. And the third, that it was actually largely driven by institutional arrangements and governance issues at a higher level. Now the reality is, of course, all 3 of these are important in different ways and in appropriate balance. And so the DEP was designed to try and get people to think about that. Oops, again. So, I mean, taking the SDGs then as a frame again, then it's easy here to put the sort of drylands into the centre there and start to think about how all of these other SDGs areas, goals, are likely to interact with achieving that outcome of land degradation neutrality. I think I'm going to skip over this slide, but we were involved in a book last year which tried to think about some of the aspects of this. And in particular, I think the issues that came out were the importance of having some positive narratives around the future instead of always this negative aspect of desertification, the problems, things, which of course resonates with what I've been saying about climate change. It highlights the importance of power relations and also of the reality that these landscapes have got to deal with ongoing global change. So I wanted just to quickly put up a framework where we've been thinking about this for Australia, for drylands in Australia, and evolving what I call the desert system, trying to think about how these, in Australia, very remote dryland systems operate. And essentially, this is how I see it happening. We have climate variability and scarce resources, which mean that we have a sparse population relative to the rest of the continent. Because we have a sparse population, it means it's remote from a lot of the decision making, from markets, from governments, you don't have any universities out in those areas, you don't have headquarters of companies and so on. But there are some other important things to do with local knowledge and cultural differences which also evolve, but I won't go into those. But all of these things result in another layer of social uncertainty. There's unpredictability from the lack of control over distant policies and markets that you can't control, and indeed changes in people leading small communities and so on. And all of that can mean that there's not very much capital around, not only financial but also physical and human capital to sort of reinvest in all of this. And there's also a limited range of livelihoods for people to engage in. And mostly people see that as a problem. They see that as a thing that just doesn't work. But in reality, it's not true. It's just functioning differently to the way that our more settled regions, our cities operate. And it actually creates just as many opportunities as problems, but we do have to be realistic about these. At the core of it, I think there's actually a remote system feedback where something or other causes a sparse population, that means they're remote, that means you have this additional uncertainty, and then you have this potential feedback. And in general, the reality is governments are going to be a long way away from that, and so they'll always be disinterested in that. But we really have to shift our mental model from complaining about that and saying it's all wrong and someone should do something about it, to actually managing for it, just accepting that that's how the system works. And when you do that, you soon realise there are all sorts of points of intervention where you can come into the system and actually change the way it operates in order to make it more sustainable in the long term, more resilient. And I'll just put up this last slide on this to say that when you explore this, that these are all the sorts of things you can do. You can think about managing with that variability and using it, because it's actually a real opportunity to do that. You can build regional critical mass in various ways which are different to how you build them in cities. You can in opportunistic ways, you can try and create more local control over things. You can use your local skills. You can do various other things. You can, perhaps very importantly, you can establish funding mechanisms which are a bit more independent and under local control. And in fact, in Australia, when we start looking at it, there are dozens of things which fit this model, which are actually happening, and it's a matter of trying to pick them up and using them and use them as a positive narrative. So I think a key issue then for drylands is that the SDGs can actually help us frame futures for these and go well beyond just the land degradation and neutrality idea. It has to, I think, include thinking about positive narratives for these regions. And there are a lot of opportunities for research again in all of this, although it almost certainly has to be interdisciplinary and probably transdisciplinary. So, just to very quickly finish off, I just wanted to come back to Future Earth for 1 minute and say that Future Earth has established this vision, which you can find on the website if you're interested. And importantly, it has a series of research challenges, 8 major challenges, which we're gradually trying to build networks around. But I think equally importantly, it emphasises products that and services that our societal partners need. So it's really trying to get to that solutions space there. And in order to do that, it really tries to emphasise some approaches to research which involve co-design and co-production and engagement with stakeholders and mobilising the capacities for that. And I think this whole model of moving from, if you like, the linear model of doing science and hoping that someone will take it up and use it, which works very well in some particular areas, and we should continue using it in those areas. But for these complex future challenges that we face, that much of the sustainable development goals are built around, we do need to move much more into this co-production of knowledge approach to research, where we are engaging with the people who may use it at the start, sometimes during the research, and also at the end, in order to get a much more rapid uptake of a much better targeted set of research and a much more rapid uptake of it in order to solve the issues that society faces. So if you're interested in following up on Future Earth, there's all the ways you can connect to that on the right-hand side there. And just down here are a couple of website areas that some of that adaptation work I mentioned can be picked up too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for a very inspiring presentation. I'm sure there are many questions. Who wants to start? If you don't want to speak in English, try to do it in Spanish and then we translate it.
Well, it seems clear to me that many of the problems are not scientifically, because there are a lot of knowledge that has been made and many issues in the environment. But I think the problem to us scientists is that we struggle how to take our research to the society and how to communicate it to other people. So, for example, you said that you were chair from one institution that do this. Can you give us some advice of how to try to establish this infrastructure, or to try to take our investigation to the people or something?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's a very important question to ask. And in fact, Elizabeth and I have been talking a bit yesterday and today about the idea of knowledge brokers, so people who may specialise in that engagement process, because I think not every scientist should feel they have to spend all their time out there talking to people in local communities at all. I don't think that's right. I do think that our institutional structures have to establish processes for doing it and get people with the appropriate skills in to do that. But you know, for someone young like you, I would say that the way to do it is to get out there and do some, and you'll find that actually there are always exciting insights to be gained from, whether it's talking to someone in the city council or someone on the streets here or someone out on a farm. It's surprising what you can learn from there, and that starts the conversation. And sometimes it won't lead to research that is within your own area of skills, but you may be able to pass it to someone else. At other times, it will perhaps just make you see that the thing that you're doing, if you just did it slightly differently or delivered it in a slightly different way, that it might be then more immediately taken up or of interest to people. So, I mean, I urge people to try that, but I also would say it is not something that everyone should have to do at all.
More questions? Comments?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask if you could elaborate more and just tell us a bit more of this last slide you had on co-production of knowledge, just because I'm very interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Chinese members of Future Earth laugh at us and say it's about co-X, because there are so many different co-somethings. Because I think in reality, co-production of knowledge is about engaging potential users, or it's engaging about the problem to start with and understanding how people out there see the problem. It is so often, I think, we have research that is doing a very interesting and important, potentially important piece of research, but because it's not quite targeted at the decision making, it can't actually be used. I'll give you an example from Australia. So in Australia, cyclones, as we call them, hurricanes, track down our east coast. Now, climate scientists for a long time have recognised that they need to predict the frequency, the future frequency of cyclones, their intensity, and their pathways. Doing the pathways in the Western Pacific turns out to be very difficult, and so most of our research has focused on the changes in frequency and intensity. The problem is, for decision makers, if you change the intensity by 10% or the frequency by 10%, it doesn't really make any difference to what we do. We have to have early warning systems, we have to have emergency management systems in place, and we have to have them anyway in those areas. We have to have buildings that are built to cyclone-proof code. And what really matters to them is the pathways, because if cyclones, hurricanes on our east coast come another 100 kilometres further south, they will hit one of the most densely populated parts of Australia. And we ought to be planning for that and changing the building codes and everything. So that is a huge economic decision. But we just haven't been, we've been doing interesting research about cyclones, but not the critical thing, which is where will the pathways go. So that's just one little example where I think as we engage with policymakers or the people who are doing the decision making around emergency services, it soon becomes clear that what they really need is the pathways in that case. So, good, engaged, co-produced research, I think, starts with an engagement around what the problem is, and of course you have to have a domain to go and talk to people about, but which you have to define yourself. But it starts with that. It may be that during the course of the research, and that helps to co-design the research, it may be during the course of research, for some types of research like agriculture, it may be that an ongoing exchange is important, but sometimes that's not important, and it's better for the scientists just to go and do it because they're the one who's expert in that. But then as you come to the end, it's very important to engage again to think about how it gets communicated and passed to other people. And so there's a sort of delivery, a co-communication. This is the coexis that the Chinese laugh at us about. But I think there's a growing amount of knowledge. In fact, in the development literature, I think people have been doing this for many decades. It's not that new, but it is quite new for some of these larger scale issues and for thinking about how you do it with the UN around the SDGs or something like that.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. Informal attention that you have a lot of interaction with enterprises in your research organization. So, is there some philosophical issues behind, or it comes just in a natural way?
Well, so there are perhaps two issues I would address there. The actual process of engaging with them, I think any of you who engage with businesses will know that it's quite hard because their timeframes are usually very short. They're wanting results very quickly, and research sometimes takes a long time. Big companies are usually aware of that and are easier to engage with than small companies. Small companies often don't have resources to help pay for research anyway. So that's one aspect of it. I don't think there's anything magical about that. It's just hard work and listening to what people need in their own context. But the other thing you may have been meaning was, do you have ethical conflicts in terms of where the research goes? Did you mean that? I mean, I think this is potentially a really important issue, and in a way, it has to be navigated on a case-by-case instance. So, I mean, CSIRO in Australia is struggling at the moment with its role in doing research on clean coal, when we're also doing research on how we actually shouldn't burn any more coal, and the emissions are challenging. So, I mean, there, I think, again, I think it's a case-by-case issue, but in that particular instance, we have quite a strong organisational discussion about reconciling those positions, and it really is that some coal burning is going to continue anyway, so trying to make that as clean as possible is really important, but that we should be messaging that within an overarching message that we need to switch out of hydrocarbons altogether. So those sorts of issues I think come up all the time. They're often important in our contracts and in our arrangements. We often, in more contentious areas, will establish a steering committee that has members of the public or other players on it in order to enable those sorts of issues to be dealt with more transparently. And actually, there's an interesting example I could tell you about after, if you like, about fracking in Northern Australia.
Someone else? I actually have a question, Mark. This idea of third generation adaptation strategies, thinking also of this very young generation here,
Right.
they're even younger than your son, so they are also all above the average of many of the global trends that we see. And somehow climate change is intangible for us. It seems like we have nothing to do with it, so we cannot do anything about it. But this idea of inducing transformations, it's something which fascinates me. However, I think it's very challenging to mainstream this even at the university level. I mean, how do you, because it implies a lot of knowledge, systems thinking, and also creativity. So how could you, or how do you in Australia maybe mainstream this kind of thinking, transformation thinking in the curricula of the university?
So I didn't talk very much about the transformation part, which we do also do quite a bit of work on. But I should start by saying I don't think Australia is transforming very well yet. So I'll tell you what I think about it, but I don't think we can point to success necessarily. I think though one of the really important things for transformation is, as you said, is that imagining the future. And so the whole issue of developing scenarios, but developing scenarios, but then engaging with them in a co-design sort of way is such an important thing for people, both envisioning what the future could be like, but also envisioning what their role could be in at least moving in that direction. Because I think it's very hard to sit here today and say that climate change, that we are not all involved in climate change. Certainly if you ask some people around Houston, they should be at least recognising that they're very involved in climate change. What can you do about it? Of course, Houston, we know very well, has a whole lot of land planning issues which are just crazy when you look at them, and are well known. So, in fact, as people in the population come to know and understand them, there are great opportunities for action, and maybe we'll see some of that over the next few years after the disaster there at the moment. I think more broadly, though, I think it is a very interesting question to ask whether universities in general can both involve their students in thinking about scenarios of the future in that sort of way, but also have become part of a movement, if you like, of engaging the public in thinking about that. Because I think our politicians at the moment, I speak for Australia anyway, are very poor at thinking about where the country should be in 2050, as opposed to what their election chances are in 5 minutes' time. So creating that movement to think about that longer term and empowering people to feel able to act towards it is a really important issue.
Thank you. Someone?
Yeah, when thinking in long-term goals, how much does it affect specific events? I'm thinking particularly political events, like election in the US, some of the things that you showed in the presentation.
That could be a very long conversation. I think we have the potential to see, well, I think firstly, my interpretation of events like Trump and Brexit and some things that have happened in Australia too are actually an outcome of increasing inequality and disempowerment of a significant part of society. So that's a trend which is very clearly in the SDGs and which the SDGs are clearly at least attempting to address. So that's triggering how perhaps some of those political changes have happened. How much it comes into political thinking at the moment, my belief is it's actually very little. I think most of our political systems, with the increasing rates of feedback from the internet and so on, are operating on a shorter and shorter time frame when these challenges are longer and longer term ones. So that's why I think a movement which really starts from the population level to require politicians to articulate their longer term visions would be a very important and valuable thing to have. I'm sure it wouldn't be the only solution. I think an interesting question, which I don't have the answer to, but is how much do really major events like the ones that are happening in the US as we speak, how much those have the potential to create a tipping point in public opinion and even political opinion and actually maybe change something. It was interesting to hear the Prime Minister of Bermuda, Antigua and Bermuda, saying that no one could see that this was was partly exacerbated by climate change, and that countries which were continuing to pretend otherwise should be very ashamed of themselves. He said that yesterday, I think. There are political pressures starting to be brought to bear because of those sorts of events. The question is whether it will happen on the US mainland, I guess. We can talk a lot more about that.
Hi. I really thought that your ideas about the uniqueness of the qualities of the dryland and the drylands communities, and to use that differences in those communities to ask research questions and stuff like that. I found that wonderful, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about examples maybe in with the averaging of cultures or in the...
Yeah, I mean, I think we have some examples and we have some big gaps that still have to be fulfilled. I mean, a nice example, which is not particularly drylands, which I always like to draw people's attention to, is the Alaska Permanent Fund. So the Alaska Permanent Fund was set up about 25 years ago, I think, as where a significant bit of the royalties from all the mining that was happening, mostly in remote areas in Alaska, went into a fund which was set up obviously by the politicians there, but it was a very visionary way of setting it up. Some of the money that comes from the fund goes back into general treasury, and politicians can then apply it as they like. But some of the funds is paid directly to every Alaskan, and so every Alaskan has a great interest in maintaining that fund. And then the management of the fund is at arm's length from politicians. They can change the structure of the fund, but it takes significant votes to do that. And so that fund has grown over the past 25 years, so that now it is delivering more money to the Alaskan economy and to individual Alaskans than they would get if they just had the money from royalties each year. And so it's a very good example of how you can opportunistically construct a way of empowering, in this case, the state of Alaska, to have resources that are under their control, but not at the whim of short-term politics. And I think we had a similar but not nearly as well-designed effort in Australia to a thing called royalties to regions, which was taking mining royalties and applying them to inland Australia. But it remained under some political control, and so inevitably the money tends to get used for partly political purposes of getting people re-elected. But nonetheless, it was an example of an opportunistic development of something which was not bad, just not as good as it could have been. I think that's thinking particularly finances, which of course is an important part of it. But there are also governance issues, and then there are much more local or narrowly targeted financial things. So I was mentioning to you yesterday, there is a trust fund for our Indigenous Aboriginal people around Ayers Rock, which is a major tourist centre in Central Australia, where the tourism proceeds, a small amount goes into this trust fund, and it is managed by the community. So it's not managed by an individual who could misuse it. It's managed by a community committee that then do things which are beneficial for the whole community. So anyway, I think there are many little examples like that, and it just speaks to trying to think about those institutional arrangements that can be put in place that may come from technological research. They may come from people doing bioprospecting or doing mining that may happen in a particular place, and thinking about the arrangements for royalties at the start can make a huge difference to the long-term outcome.